Hey everyone, before we get started, let us know in the comments where you're tuning in from. We love seeing how far our stories reach. And make sure to hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications, so YouTube keeps sending you more spine-chilling stories like these. The flash of a firework is supposed to be a celebration, a bright signal of a new beginning. But when that light hit the glass of the apartment across the street, all I saw was the end of a life. I was standing on my 4th-floor balcony, shivering in the crisp December air while holding a lukewarm plastic cup of cheap champagne that I didn't even want to drink. The party behind me was a dull roar of muffled bass and the forced laughter of people I barely knew. So I had stepped out into the freezing night just to find a second of silence before the clock struck 12. The city was alive with a restless, frantic energy, and every balcony in the complex across the narrow alleyway was filled with people cheering and waving glow sticks. But there was one unit, for B, that remained completely dark, its floor-to-ceiling windows acting like a black mirror reflecting the colorful explosions in the sky. I found myself staring at it, wondering why anyone would sit in total darkness on the loudest night of the year, and that was when the first massive gold firework detonated directly above our street. For 3 seconds, the entire alley was washed in a blinding, artificial noon, and in that window of light, I saw him. There was a man in 4B, dressed in a heavy dark parka, and he wasn't celebrating. He was standing over a slumped figure in a chair, his gloved hands wrapped tightly around a thin cord that was buried deep into the victim's neck. The victim's legs were kicking out in a frantic, rhythmic struggle that looked sickeningly like a dance, and then the light vanished, plunging the room back into a deep, suffocating shadow. My heart didn't just race. It stopped entirely, freezing the blood in my veins as I stood there with my hand gripped tight around the cold metal railing. I told myself I had imagined it, that it was just a trick of the shadows and the sudden strobe effect of the pyrotechnics. But then the next firework went off, a brilliant crimson red. This time, the man in the parka wasn't looking at his victim anymore. He was looking directly across the alleyway, his face illuminated by the red glow, and his eyes locked straight onto mine. He knew. He saw the phone in my left hand, the screen glowing bright against my face, and he saw the look of absolute, soul-crushing terror that I couldn't hide fast enough. I ducked down instantly, pressing my back against the cold brick of my balcony wall, my breath coming in jagged, wheezing gasps that felt like needles in my lungs. I needed to call the police, but my fingers were shaking so violently that I nearly dropped my phone through the gaps in the floorboards. I finally managed to swipe the screen open, my thumb sliding over the glass, but then I heard it. It wasn't a firework, and it wasn't a party popper. It was the heavy, metallic thud of a fire escape door slamming shut somewhere very close by. The alleyway was narrow, barely 15 feet wide, and there was a shared service bridge on the ground floor that connected our 2 buildings for maintenance crews. If he was fast, and if he didn't care about being seen in the chaos, he could be in my lobby in less than 60 seconds. I crawled back into my apartment through the sliding glass door, staying low to the ground so my silhouette wouldn't show against the light of the party. I expected my friends to notice my face, to see the panic and ask me what was wrong. But the music had just transitioned into a deafening techno remix of Auld Lang Syne. Everyone was jumping, their eyes closed, their arms in the air, completely oblivious to the fact that a murderer was likely navigating the stairwell just 50 feet away from them. I pushed through the crowd, my shoulders bumping into sweaty bodies, as I made a literal run for my front door. I reached the heavy oak wood and turned the deadbolt, feeling a small surge of relief that lasted only a fraction of a second. Through the tiny fisheye peephole, I saw the motion sensor light in the hallway flicker on. It was empty for a moment, and then a shadow stretched across the carpet, long and distorted, coming from the direction of the emergency exit. He wasn't running. He was walking with a slow, predatory confidence because he knew exactly where I was, and he knew that the sound of 500 people screaming 10, 9, 8 would drown out any scream I could possibly make. I backed away from the door, my mind racing through my options, realizing that my apartment was a dead end with no other way out except the balcony I had just fled from. I ran to the kitchen and grabbed the largest knife I could find, a serrated bread knife that felt pathetic and light in my trembling hand. I retreated into my bedroom, locking that door as well, and crawled into the back of my walk-in closet, burying myself behind a row of heavy winter coats. I pressed the phone to my ear, finally hearing the 911 operator's voice, but she sounded 1,000 miles away, her voice competing with the rhythmic thumping of the party in the next room. I saw a murder. He's in my building. Apartment 412, please, he's coming for me. I whispered, my voice cracking and failing as I heard the unmistakable sound of my front door being kicked. It didn't splinter on the first try, but on the second, the frame gave way with a sickening crack that was perfectly timed with the roar of the crowd in the living room shouting 3, 2, 1, Happy New Year. The apartment erupted in cheers, the sound of champagne corks popping like muffled gunfire, and through the gap in my closet door, I heard the heavy boots enter my living room. He was moving through my guests, weaving through the dancers who probably thought he was just another late arrival to the party. I stayed silent, my eyes watering from the sheer pressure of holding my breath, watching the shadow of his boots stop right outside my bedroom door. He turned the handle, and when it didn't budge, he didn't kick it. He waited. He waited for the music to hit its highest peak, for the bass to vibrate the very floorboards I was sitting on, and then I heard the wood groan as he put his shoulder into it. I squeezed my eyes shut, praying for the police to arrive, praying for a miracle, and then I heard the most beautiful sound in the world. It wasn't the police. It was the building's fire alarm. One of the party guests, in their drunken celebration, had knocked over a tray of decorative candles onto a polyester rug in the hallway, and the thick black smoke had triggered the overhead sprinklers. The high-pitched, piercing shriek of the alarm was impossible to ignore, and within seconds, the partygoers began to scream in genuine panic, rushing for the exit in a massive, disorganized stampede. The man at my door hesitated. I could see his shadow shift, his head turning toward the chaos behind him. He had lost his cover. He couldn't kill me in a room full of people fleeing a fire, not with the fire department and police mere minutes away. I heard his boots retreat, moving quickly back toward the balcony or the fire escape, disappearing into the smoke and the crowd. I didn't come out until the police dragged me out 20 minutes later. They found the body in 4B, just as I had described, but the man in the parka was gone, melted away into the thousands of people celebrating on the streets below. I survived that New Year's Eve, but I never look out of windows anymore because I still see his face. The gold embossed card had arrived in my mailbox 3 days after Christmas, tucked inside a heavy vellum envelope that felt far too expensive for a simple party invite. It promised an exclusive New Year's midnight gala on the rooftop of the abandoned St. Jude Hotel, a towering relic of the 1920s that had been shuttered for decades in the heart of the downtown district. I wasn't the type to get invited to secret parties, but the note inside was personal, mentioning my name and claiming that a mutual friend wanted to celebrate my recent promotion in a way I would never forget. Looking back, I should have questioned why a mutual friend wouldn't just text me, but the lure of a private view of the city's massive fireworks display was too tempting to ignore. I arrived at the service entrance of the hotel at 11 o'clock, the wind whistling through the narrow alleys like a wounded animal while the distant sounds of the city's revelry felt worlds away. The heavy iron door was propped open with a single brick, and a small, battery-operated LED light pointed toward the freight elevator, which looked as though it hadn't been inspected since the Great Depression. I stepped inside the metal cage, the gears groaning and shrieking as I pressed the button for the penthouse level, feeling a strange pit of anxiety form in my stomach as the lobby vanished from view. The ride took nearly 2 minutes, a slow, rattling ascent that left me alone with nothing but the hum of the motor and my own reflection in the tarnished brass walls. When the doors finally slid open, I expected to step into a room filled with jazz, expensive perfume, and the clinking of crystal glasses, but instead, I stepped into the freezing night air of a desolate rooftop. There were no caterers, no music, and no mutual friends, waiting to hand me a drink under the stars. There was only a single folding table in the center of the tar-covered roof, holding a silver bucket with a bottle of champagne and 2 glasses that glittered under the pale light of the moon. I walked toward the edge of the roof, the gravel crunching under my dress shoes, and looked out at the skyline where thousands of people were gathered in the streets below, looking like tiny, glowing ants. "Hello!" I called out, my voice swallowed instantly by the wind, but there was no response, only the rhythmic flapping of a loose tarp somewhere in the shadows. I turned back toward the elevator, thinking I had surely arrived at the wrong time or perhaps the wrong building, but the metal cage was already descending back toward the ground floor. I ran to the call button and mashed it repeatedly, but the light remained dark, and the machinery stayed silent as if the power had been cut from below. I felt a sudden, sharp prickle of sweat on my neck despite the cold, and I turned around to scan the dark corners of the rooftop, realizing for the first time how many places there were for someone to hide. That was when I heard the sound of a heavy padlock being snapped shut. It didn't come from the elevator, but from the only other exit, the heavy steel door that led to the emergency stairwell. I ran across the roof, my heart hammering against my ribs like a trapped bird, and I grabbed the handle, pulling with everything I had, but the door didn't budge an inch. Through the small, wire-reinforced glass window in the door, I saw a silhouette standing on the other side, a figure draped in a dark maintenance jumpsuit with a face obscured by a cheap, plastic New Year's mask. He wasn't moving. He was just standing there, watching me through the glass with a stillness that was more terrifying than any threat he could have shouted. "Who are you? Open the door!" I screamed, pounding my fists against the steel until my knuckles began to bleed, but the figure only tilted its head slightly to the side. He reached up and tapped on his wristwatch, pointing to the glowing dial as if to remind me that the countdown was about to begin. I realized then that I wasn't a guest at a party. I was a target in a cage, and this person had spent a lot of money and time to ensure that I was exactly where he wanted me when the clock struck 12. I looked back at the champagne bottle on the table and saw a small white envelope tucked underneath the base, one I hadn't noticed when I first arrived. I walked over with trembling legs and opened it, my breath hitching as I read the typed words. "You took everything from her 3 years ago tonight. Now I'm gonna watch you give it all back." My mind raced through my memories, searching for a face, a name, or an accident, and then it hit me. The hit and run on New Year's Eve 3 years ago that the police had never solved because the driver had disappeared into the fog. I hadn't been the driver, but I had been in the passenger seat, and I had stayed silent to protect my brother, who had been behind the wheel. Someone had finally found us, and they didn't want justice through the courts. They wanted a life for a life. I looked back at the door, but the masked figure was gone, and the silence of the roof was suddenly broken by the first thunderous boom of the fireworks display. The sky erupted in a violent spray of emerald green and strobe light white, illuminating the rooftop in jagged flashes that made the shadows dance. In the light of the second explosion, I saw him again. He wasn't behind the door anymore. He had climbed the external maintenance ladder and was now standing on the raised ledge of the water tower, holding a long, heavy iron pipe in his hand. He jumped down with a thud that I felt in my teeth, and he began to walk toward me, the pipe scraping against the gravel with a slow, rhythmic hiss. I had nowhere to run, and the drop from the edge of the building was over 40 stories of sheer concrete and glass. I backed away, my heels catching on a loose wire, and I fell hard onto the tar, the man closing the distance with a terrifying slow-motion gait. He didn't say a word, which was the worst part, because the lack of emotion made him feel like an inevitable force of nature rather than a man. As he raised the pipe for the first strike, the sky turned a deep, blood red from a massive firework cluster, and I saw my only chance for survival lying right next to the champagne bucket. It was the silver ice bucket itself, heavy and filled with half-melted slush and a solid glass bottle. As he swung the pipe down, I rolled to the left, the iron whistling past my ear and slamming into the gravel with enough force to sparks. I grabbed the champagne bottle by the neck and swung it with every ounce of adrenaline-fueled strength I possessed, catching him squarely across the side of his plastic mask. The bottle didn't break, but the impact was enough to stagger him, sending him reeling backward toward the edge of the roof where the railing had been rusted away by decades of neglect. He flailed for a second, his boots skidding on the slick tar, and for a heartbeat, our eyes met through the holes in his mask, eyes filled with a grief so deep it almost made me stop. But then his heel hit the empty space where the railing should have been, and he tipped backward into the dark abyss just as the finale of the fireworks began. The sky turned into a blinding wall of white light and deafening noise, masking the sound of his fall and the end of his quest for revenge. I stood there for a long time, clutching the cold glass bottle, watching the smoke drift over the city while the crowds below cheered for a new year they thought was full of hope. I eventually found a heavy wrench in a maintenance box near the elevator and managed to pry the doors open enough to trip the manual release. I didn't call the police that night, and I didn't tell my brother what had happened on that roof. I just went home, burned the gold-embossed invitation in my fireplace, and sat in the dark until the sun came up. I survived the invitation, but I know now that some debts are never truly paid off, and every New Year's Eve, I stay far away from the heights of the city. The suburban silence of my neighborhood was always a lie on New Year's Eve, a thin veil of peace that was systematically torn apart by the rhythmic explosions of illegal pyrotechnics starting as early as 8 o'clock. I was alone in my 2-story house, tucked away at the end of a quiet cul-de-sac, nursing a cold that had stolen my voice and left me feeling fragile and slow. My plan was simple: stay on the couch, watch the ball drop on a muted television, and try to sleep through the war zone that my street usually becomes at midnight. But as the clock ticked toward 11, I noticed something that felt fundamentally wrong about the noise coming from my own backyard. Most people in the neighborhood were setting off Roman candles and sparklers, creating a consistent, distant popping sound that blended into a hum of celebration. However, there was a new sound, a heavy, rhythmic thudding that seemed to sync up perfectly with the loudest bursts of light in the sky. I sat up, pulling my wool blanket tighter around my shoulders, and looked toward the sliding glass door that led to my patio. Every time a massive firework detonated overhead, washing my living room in a sickly neon green or a violent violet, I heard a sharp, metallic crack coming from the direction of my basement bulkhead door. I told myself it was just the wind, or perhaps a neighbor's stray firework hitting the siding of the house, but the timing was too deliberate, too surgical to be an accident. Someone was outside, and they weren't just making noise. They were using the chaos of the sky to mask the sound of a sledgehammer meeting a padlock. I stood up, my legs feeling like lead, and crept toward the kitchen to grab my phone. But as I reached the counter, the largest firework of the night, a Big Bertha, from the house 3 doors down, exploded with a force that rattled my windows. In that exact second of peak noise, I heard the unmistakable sound of splintering followed by the heavy, echoing thud of a basement door being kicked off its hinges. The house went silent again as the fireworks smoke drifted away, and I stood frozen in the dark kitchen, my heart pounding so hard I could feel it in my fingertips. I knew that if I called out, I would be giving away my position, and with my voice reduced to a raspy whisper from the flue, I couldn't even scream for help if I wanted to. I needed to get to the front door, but to do that, I had to pass the basement stairs, a dark, yawning mouth in the hallway that felt like it was exhaling a cold, damp breath from the earth below. I began to crawl across the hardwood floor, hoping the shadows would hide me, but then the next set of explosions began. A rapid-fire series of crackle shells that sounded like a machine gun. Under the cover of that noise, I heard boots hitting the wooden stairs of the basement, moving upward with a slow, calculated heavy-footedness. They weren't rushing because they knew the neighborhood was distracted by the light show, and they knew that even if a neighbor heard a strange noise, they would just assume it was another celebratory blast. I reached the hallway and looked toward the basement door just as a flash of red light from outside illuminated the landing. A man was standing there, his face covered by a dark tactical balaclava, and he was holding a heavy crowbar that glistened with the remains of my basement door's hardware. He didn't see me in the shadows of the floorboards, but he stopped, tilting his head as if he were listening for the sound of a heartbeat. I realized then that he wasn't here for my television or my jewelry. He was moving toward the master bedroom with a focused, predatory intent that suggested he had been watching me for a long time. I waited for the next burst of fireworks, a massive gold willow that crackled for nearly 10 seconds, and I used that window of noise to scramble into the laundry room and slide behind the heavy dryer. I pulled a pile of towels over my legs, praying that the scent of detergent would mask the smell of my own fear-induced sweat. Through the gap between the dryer and the wall, I watched the man's shadow move across the kitchen floor, his silhouette cast long and terrifying by the streetlights outside. He moved with a terrifying patience, opening drawers silently and checking behind curtains, always pausing when the sky went dark and moving only when the next firework provided him with audio cover. I realized with a jolt of horror that he was timing his breaths with mine, or at least it felt that way in the suffocating closeness of the laundry room. I reached into my pocket and felt my phone, but I realized I had left it on the kitchen counter in my rush to hide. I was completely cut off, trapped in a house with a man who was literally using the New Year's celebration as a tool for my destruction. He finally entered the laundry room, the floorboards groaning under his weight, and I watched his boots stop just inches from my hiding spot. He stood there for what felt like an eternity, the crowbar tapping lightly against his leg in a rhythmic, taunting motion. The countdown in the distance had begun, and I could hear the muffled voices of my neighbors through the walls, shouting out the numbers, 10, 9, 8. The man raised the crowbar, and for a second, I thought he had seen me, that he was simply waiting for the final one to end me while the world cheered. 5, 4, 3. The voices outside were reaching a fever pitch, and the sky was beginning to glow with the impending finale of 1,000 coordinated rockets. The man turned his head toward the window, distracted for a split second by a stray firework that hissed past the glass, and I knew it was my only chance. I didn't try to run for the door. I reached out and grabbed the heavy, industrial-sized bottle of liquid bleach that was sitting on the floor next to me and threw it with every bit of desperate strength I had at his feet. The bottle didn't hit him, but it burst open, slicking the linoleum floor with a slippery, caustic puddle of chemicals just as the finale began. The sky turned into a solid wall of white light and thunderous sound, and the man stepped forward to grab me, his boots losing all traction on the bleached floor. He went down hard, the back of his head hitting the edge of the washing machine with a sickening crack that was perfectly timed with the loudest explosion of the night. He slumped to the floor, the crowbar clattering away from his hand, and he didn't move again. I didn't wait to see if he was breathing. I scrambled over his legs, my hands stinging from the bleach on the floor, and I ran out the front door into the middle of the street. I was sobbing and gasping for air, waving my arms at my neighbors who were still hugging and clinking glasses on their porches. It took them a moment to realize that my screams weren't part of the celebration, but once they saw the blood on my hands and the look of pure vacancy in my eyes, the music stopped and the phones came out. The police found him exactly where he fell, a man with a long history of celebration burglaries who had targeted my house because he knew I lived alone and was sick. They found a map of my floor plan in his pocket and a set of zip ties that made it very clear what his resolutions for the new year had been. I stayed at a hotel for the rest of the week, and I eventually sold the house, moving to a high-rise with 24-hour security and windows that don't open. Now, every time New Year's Eve rolls around, I don't look at the fireworks. I just put on noise-canceling headphones and wait for the sun to come up on a quiet, empty world.